Our final speaker of this action-packed weekend is going to be Professor Martin van Kranendonk from University of New South Wales. I've known Martin for many years. He spent a long time with the Geological Survey of Western Australia and did a prolific amount of mapping in the Pilbara region in particular, and is regarded as the world's foremost authority on the earliest rocks in the world, really. Well, certainly in Australia, and they are amongst the earliest rocks in the world. In fact, they're the best preserved early rocks of the early Earth. And Martin has done an amazing amount of work on the early life forms that are in these rocks. And then he branched out and he went back to academia and joined the University of New South Wales. They formed this he took over the astrobiology unit from, who was it, Martin? Malcolm Walter, who was a very well-known figure, and they're doing it's incredibly interesting work. So linking the celestial with the terrestrial, presumably.
Presumably.
Yeah.
Thanks, Greg.
Over to you, Martin.
Okay. Does anybody know what astrobiology is? Astro, star, biology, life. So it's really about the search for life on the stars. But stars are a little bit hot, aren't they? So we actually limit that down to sort of planetary bodies. And the idea is we've got an example of life as a one-off. Life is here on Earth. But because it's such an active planet, we can't see back far enough in time to understand how life got started. And the interest then is to find places where we can get a bit of that very earliest history, like we've heard a lot about on the meteorites, but also to answer the question, are we alone? Is life a fundamental part of the universe? Did it happen many times? Is it everywhere? Or is this just a one-off chance? Those are some of the big questions, of course, that we try to answer in astrobiology. And so if you could choose anywhere in the universe, if you had a rocket ship, where would you go? And that's a question that's of great interest to many people, and there are space agencies around this planet that are actually dealing with that question. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and bring in both the Murchison meteorite and the work we've done on early life on Earth to help us inform where to go and what actually to look for. So where would you go? Would you go in our own solar system? Certainly at the moment with our technology, that's our limiting factor. We can search for some places in the solar system, but the question is, would you search the rings of Saturn? Would you go and look in the clouds of Jupiter? Would you look at hot Venus, that surface temperature of 450 degrees? Or what about the red dust on Mars? Or maybe the sulfur volcanoes of Io? Or perhaps even the liquid methane lakes on Titan? Or perhaps, as we've heard already, the water ice of one of the moons of the giant planets, Enceladus here. One of the amazing things when I was a student was the discovery trip by Voyager that really uncovered the incredible diversity of the solar system. It's just an incredible place to live. We're so lucky. So where would you go? Or how about going outside of the solar system? What about the exoplanets that have been discovered over the past few years? There are now thousands of exoplanets, and we know that most star systems, in fact, more than 90% of star systems, have planets as well. So these are all examples of exoplanets that have been found. Here are the big gas giants, Jupiter, but you can see that some of them are getting very close to the size of Earth. And we know now that some of them are in the habitable zone, where there's liquid water. So there's huge excitement about exoplanets. And of course, there was a recent discovery, only announced, I think, last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, of finding a super Earth size, so slightly bigger than Earth, but they could identify the atmosphere had water vapor. And that's an enormous step in our exploration of the universe for potential zones where there might be habitable life. So, of course, to get life, we've heard about it many times today, and I'm sorry I wasn't there yesterday to hear about it again, but we've heard that the starting blocks is you need a rocky planet to host life. You need somewhere to have life develop. It can't just form in a gas. You need volume, and you need complex reactions to happen. So we need a planetary body, and it's got to be a rocky planet because the gas is not sustainable for making complex reactions. And we've heard that we need meteorites, like the Murchison meteorite, to bring in those early building blocks, the organic molecules, which are just a natural part of the universe. And I think one thing that you should consider about is, we think about the Earth as being so special because it's got water. We think about these incredible carbon life forms, but actually those are the two most common components of the universe, carbon and water. So life, in terms of that material, is actually, it makes sense. But what I want to talk to you more, and it's because of bringing in these kind of molecules, these organic molecules that we heard about earlier today that have carbon, doesn't mean they're alive, but they have the building blocks, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and they are the things that are used to make DNA, the stuff that stores our genetic information. But it turns out we need two other basic ingredients to make life. One, in fact, is water, and that's been a paradigm for the last 40 years or more, because everywhere on Earth where there's life, there's water. But you also need this aspect. You need the heat from the sun and drying. And that's something that probably not many of you have thought about before or understand the necessity for. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So if you add all those ingredients together, hopefully you get something like this, a self-organized system of very simple, primitive organisms called microbes that are just single cells, but that replicate, share their information, and evolve over time into things like humans and elephants and otherwise. So that's what we're talking about for that. So let's start with the first aspect, water, as one of our two basic ingredients. Why? Because everywhere where there is life on Earth, there is water. And that goes from elephants right down to single-celled organisms that live in snow. This red coloration is actually due to a particular type of microbe that uses a bit of iron, but it also needs water. And in fact, we know that if we go back in geological time, all life on Earth, going back to 3.5, 3.7 billion years ago, needed water. So water on Earth is everywhere where there is life. And of course, this has led to NASA's main paradigm for exploration of the solar system in terms of looking for Earth is to follow the water. And in that, there's been this idea of the Goldilocks zone, or what's now called the habitable zone, that depending on the size of the star, how far out the planets are, is where you can have a zone of liquid water. And you see Earth falls right in that habitable zone, and depending on how big the star is, that habitable zone might be closer or further away from the star. But this has caused NASA in their exploration model, and in fact for the last many decades, most have been using this idea of follow the water, because if there's life, there's water. So if there's water, could there be life? That's the inverse of that. But what about this aspect? Why hot and dry? What is that all about? Well, it turns out that if we think about life, even the simplest microbe is already an unbelievably complicated city-state on its own. It has 3 different types of membranes that separate it from the outside. Its internal chemistry is completely different from that of oceanic water. It has pumps that allow things to come from the outside, from the inside, and from the inside outside. And the material inside is organized into many different organelles. We always think about just DNA and all of a sudden you've got life. But that's not the case. They're unbelievably sophisticated little units. This one is a bacteria. It happens to have a little motor called a flagellum. But even the most primitive ones have many of these components. So yeah, if you have life already, then these water worlds might be really exciting. But how do you get life? That's, of course, the huge question. And that, in fact, involves something other than just water. So in terms of getting the building blocks to make life, a water world, here it's good for life, but in terms to make those building blocks, it's not so easy. So what we're talking about is actually the pathway from the molecules that are brought in by things like Murchison meteorite, going down to this complex. This is, of course, the many billion-dollar question. This is the origin of life. How do you do it? And we don't know. That's just, I'm putting it right out there, we don't know. We know a few of the steps, and that's generating quite a bit of excitement. But what has recently come to light are the importance of some of those steps relative to another. And this is a very complicated looking slide, but it's actually very simple. We've heard that Murchison brings in things like amino acids, and there are much more than 20. How many are there now? Almost, sorry? 70 types of amino acids. But the trick is to get amino acids to form into more complex molecules that lead down towards something like an RNA. Can you see the reaction? In each case, you've got to kick out a molecule of water. It's the power of drying that bonds those simple organic molecules together. And this was recognized already long ago, but it was encapsulated in this quote by David Deamer in his book called First Life, that you can heat a solution of amino acids in water forever, but no polymers, meaning complicated molecules, will ever form. On the other hand, you can make polymers if the amino acids are in a dry state. The source of the energy is that water molecules have the potential to leave the system. So guess what, guys? An origin of life in the oceans cannot happen. That has been known for a long time, but the relevance of that is only really starting to trickle down into ideas of how to explore for life elsewhere. There are other problems with oceans. They're too salty. So the first one is that they're too wet, the oceans are too salty, and they're actually too dilute. The volume is too big to concentrate some of those key ingredients for life, like carbon, like other elements that are needed to bond the atoms together, the molecules together. And so there's a new paradigm shift going on that suggests that the oceans were not the setting for the origin of life. Not about once life got started, but the origin of life. To make those complex molecules bond together, you can't do it in the oceans. So you need this, and people now are starting to think about the origin of life on land. But of course, this scenario is too extreme. It's all dry and baked out, so you need a source of water. And what people are starting to think about is an origin of life in hot springs, as Charles Darwin already thought about more than 145 years ago, some warm little pond. Well, it turns out, as in so many things, Charles Darwin may have in fact been the luminary that still guides our science today. The key thing about hot springs is they can undergo what are called wet-dry cycles. So the pools are often mostly full, but they can dry down because of evaporation or actually because of the physical drawdown of water under different fluid pressure, and that leaves an area where the concentrated organics from the infalling meteoritic material that we heard about could get concentrate and undergo the drying to make those molecules become more complex. And people have done experiments in the lab and shows that this works. Polymers have been made on the edges of real hot spring pools, not just in the lab. And then, of course, they can get wetted because the water rises again, you get geysers, and this can happen every hour. Think of a hot spring field. They typically have 100 pools. Think of a geyser splashing every hour, wet, dry cycles. How many years does it take to get 1 trillion reactions? It actually only takes about 10 million years. So in fact, if this scenario is plausible, something as complicated as life, let's say it takes 1 trillion reactions, nobody knows, but it could have happened relatively quickly. Not the billions of years we used to think about, but life getting started quickly on a planetary body. And that gives us hope for searching for life elsewhere. The other exciting thing about hot spring fields is that there's not just one, but there are many pools, and they have very different chemistry. Here's an example from Rotorua in New Zealand, where we have a pool that's giving us sulfur. It's very acidic. If you dipped your toe in there, you would burn the skin off your foot, like happened to my colleague, Kathy Campbell, in New Zealand. But one just only about 20 meters away is neutral. They're completely separate chemical bodies, but they mix and match their material because the water flows out and it mixes. And that provides energy and complexity and interactions of molecules and elements and mixing. It's just incredible zones for chemical and energetic diversity. In fact, hot spring fields are the most geologically complex area on Earth. In fact, in the solar system, as far as we know. So if life is a response to complexity, hot springs are the place where complexity happens. And so this wet-dry cycle allows these kinds of reactions to happen, to make polypeptides, to make sugars, to make carbohydrates, and to take those nucleic acids that come in from Murchison, combine it with some Earth-like materials to make these long, complicated molecules that form the basis for life. So, what about the implications for astrobiology? Because if we use follow the water as our search engine, that's all good for when life has already started. But what about if life, did those bodies have the conditions required to get life started? It's a different question, but it actually leads to the same thing. So what about places like these water ice worlds, Enceladus, Europa? They're permanently wet. They're covered by a thick body of water and by an ice crust. They never had exposed rocks. They never had the chance to do wet-dry cycles. So I would say that I'm not that excited by those places in terms of astrobiology to search for life. What about Titan? Well, Titan's exciting. It has these lots of organic materials on these lakes. This is actually a picture from the satellite as it was dropping down. This is a picture out of a lake of liquid methane. So there's lots of organics, but again, it doesn't have the rocky substrate in terms of silicate materials that you need to help bind those organic molecules together. So again, there's a lot of excitement about Titan, but for me, if we accept this origin of life on land hypothesis, it doesn't really work. So then the question turns closer to home, what about Mars? Well, when I first got interested in Mars, I wasn't that excited about it because it looks like it never had an ocean. We all know that it's dry, dusty, and dead. Here's an actual image of a dust devil going across the surface of Mars. This is what the surface looks like today. There's certainly no water on the surface. It's impacted by high radiation. See, all the rocks are broken up. But what has turned out over the last few years is that there's really good evidence that there is still some water on Mars. Here's actually a frozen little pool of what was liquid water. There's hoarfrost on the outer part of this crater rim, so there's actively still some water on Mars. But in the past, there were giant flowing river channels. About 3.5 billion years ago, there was flowing water on Mars. There was a hydrological cycle. And these carved river channels made lakes and deltas just like we know on Earth and deposited sedimentary rocks in standing bodies of water and lakes. This all looks really cool for that idea of follow the water. And so the modern and upcoming 2 missions to Mars by NASA's Mars 2020 rover and by Europe's ExoMars rover are both using that paradigm of follow the water. Mars 2020 is going to this beautiful little delta complex here on the lip of Jezero Crater. This is a river that used to flow into Jezero Crater about 2 to 3 billion years ago. You can see all the channels. This was definitely made by flowing water. And they're sending the rover. They're going to land here on these basaltic plains and explore the outer parts of this delta to see if they can find little bits of trapped organic material in those river deposits. ExoMars is going to Exoplanets, and they're going to look for something that looks like this. This is a photo taken by the Curiosity rover of Mars that's up there now exploring. And these are lake deposits. These are very finely bedded rocks on Mars, not Earth. And they're going to also drill through lake deposits on Exoplanets, looking to see if there's any remnants of life's telltale impact on Mars from very ancient rocks from 3.5 billion years ago. So what would they exactly be looking for? And this is where I bring in the work that we've done on the oldest life on Earth. Here's the area where the oldest, best preserved evidence for life is found, up here in the northwest in an area called the Pilbara of Western Australia. And what they'd be looking for are structures in rocks like this. These rocks are about 3.5 billion years ago in Australia. And the structures you see here, these wrinkly kind of mats and these dome structures, were made by colonies of millions or even billions of single-celled microbes. They made these communities that covered the floor of the wet basins, and they formed structures that started to grow up and make texture that we cannot explain by geology. And this was first discovered already back in 1980, and these structures were likened to, this is what they look like when they're away from the effects of the rain and the air. When we got samples from drill core, we'd find these beautiful columnar structures. They're quite small here, but we found layers of these structures that look very much like what modern communities and rock structures made by living organisms in Shark Bay, Western Australia look like. So this is a different scale, but the structures are very much the same. These are made up of layers of rock caused by communities of microbes. And the only thing about these big structures here, they're actually solid rock at the base. But if you touch them at the top, they're a little bit soft and spongy. And when you look at them under a microscope, you'll see that they're made up of these single-celled, these filaments of single-celled organisms. That actually builds these rock structures over thousands of years. And we can see the same textures without the in these ancient rocks. But what we have found in a paper just published 2 days ago in Geology was that trapped within this metallic material called pyrite are remnants of organic matter that have branching, curling structures that are identical to what we see related to modern microbial communities, strands of organic matter preserved that can only be made by life. And this is now a real diagnostic fingerprint for life very, very long ago on Earth. Could we find something like that on Mars? That would be like the Holy Grail. But that's all the story about follow the water. What about this idea of hot springs? Well, the exciting thing, the really exciting thing that drew me into studying life on Mars, the possibility of life on Mars, is that first, at this extinct volcano on Mars called Nili Patera, they found these bright white deposits that are of opaline silica. Opal is silica that still has water in the structure, and it hasn't recrystallized to quartz. These only form in very few environments, and it turns out that these were hot springs on Mars already very, very long ago, again about 3.5 billion years ago. And here's a little mound with that hot spring silica coming out of the top and then flowing down on the bottom. And then at Columbia Hills, where the previous Spirit rover was, they found similar deposits. This is what they look like. This is an actual picture from the Spirit rover on the surface of Mars. There are these nodules of opaline silica that have a very unusual texture. And it turns out when you look at them in detail, the red is from Mars, and the white and the gray is from Earth, from a hot spring in Chile, the most Mars-like environment on Earth, high, dry, very exposed to radiation. They found the identical growth textures as they found in the opaline silica structures on Mars. And guess what? This is opaline silica. And guess what, number two? If you look at the inside of those little fingers on Earth, they're packed with microbes, preserved in the silica. Because silica is like an Egyptian tomb. It comes out of the hot spring, flows over the microbial mat that's growing there, and entombs it and keeps it encased for billions of years. And so the question is, could we go and explore those hot spring deposits on Mars? Because if life started in hot springs, the most primitive environment could be hot springs, and they preserve signs of life. And so we're now talking to the Japanese Space Agency about a future mission to bring back hot spring samples from Mars to see if these nodular features contain traces of the signs for life. Thank you very much. I wanted to thank Graham very much for the invitation to come to this wonderful event. It's great that all of you stayed for the entire afternoon, and I wish you a very good rest of the weekend.
Thanks, Martin. Well, that's a really exciting final talk to have to make that whole connection through to life like that. Do we have any questions? Andy?
What do you think of some of the rod-like structures that have been found in some meteor or some of the larger meteorites? Are these purely inorganic, or are they suggestive?
So there was a big splash back in the 90s, made the cover of Time magazine. Life on Mars found, because they'd found these structures that looked like very small microbes in a meteorite that came to Earth. So a really pertinent question for this environment. But I know a guy who's worked on those, and it turns out that to study the samples, they had to coat a very thin slice of those samples in a gold coating. So when you zap a beam on a sample, of course the energy goes and it would just fly apart. But if you put a metallic coating on it, the energy disperses and you can actually see the texture. So they coat samples with gold or with carbon or with platinum. And it turns out in the late 80s and 90s when they did this study, they coated it. And what happens is they get a source of gold and they sputter it. They throw atoms of gold out of this thing. But it wasn't a perfect distribution. And some of these would clump and make those rod-like structures. So it turns out that the strongest piece of evidence for life on the Allen Hills 84001 meteorite was an artifact of sample preparation. And so that sounds really embarrassing for science, doesn't it? But that's how science works. Science works by learning about our mistakes and doing something better. So now people only use platinum coating, which doesn't make these little baubles and rods and stuff. So we're developing, and all of this research is right at the forefront of science. A lot of what you've heard today from Phil, from all of the speakers, and even I'm sure yesterday, is right at the forefront of what we as humans are capable of doing. And yeah, we make some mistakes along the way, but we're always moving forward. So yeah, you can say that, oh, that was back in the 80s and nice, ha, ha, ha. But actually, you know, we're always learning about how we do things. So it's a good tale about science itself.
The things you're finding that you were showing us that are on Mars, signs of life, is it signs of life being created or signs that life was there once?
No, so maybe I've gotten you a little bit confused. There's no signs of life yet on Mars. The silica stuff, yeah. So we've got actual pictures. We know the composition. All the textures are there that we can say, oh, look, that matches the texture on Earth. But what we don't know is because we don't have the instruments to look at that really fine detail. So what we want to do is actually bring a sample back to Earth and use our really good quality labs here on Earth to make those decisions. Because the rovers that go up there now, they have some really sophisticated instruments, but because they're packed for space, they're only very limited in what they can do. They can give us a broad picture, but not the detail to prove life. Because you don't want to go to Mars and say, oh, I think there's life there. That would just be silly. You want to say, you know, we've got definite proof. And so to do that, you'd have to bring the samples back.
In your mind,
yeah.
Do you think it might be signs of life that was there and, you know, or that's what life became, just these things?
So we went to the workshops to decide where to send the Mars 2020 rover, which launches next year. They had 3 sites, and one of them included the hot springs. And the person who led that discussion is a fellow called Steve Ruff. And he called those nodular things potential biosignatures because of their very distinctive morphology. What we haven't done yet, and what I see, I've got a new PhD student, I'm going to line up for this, is to actually start making a hot spring in the lab and see if we can make those structures without biology. Do it under sterile conditions, low atmosphere, early Earth-like conditions, and see if those fingers kind of can grow naturally without biology. So that's the next kind of thing, is to actually see how far we can go in the lab, or can we just make them, you know, any old way? They can form a million. I know I look old, but I'm not that old.
John?
Just a follow-up question to that. There's been some pretty interesting recent data on methane emissions from Curiosity.
Yeah.
No. Methane emissions.
Yeah, so there have been measurements on and off on the surface of Mars about little puffs of methane. And methane is a molecule that can be made by life. It can also be made by non-life processes. And the first measurements, they were rather uncertain about it, and then they went to remeasure, they didn't find anything, but now there has been a real confirmation that there has been a concentrated whiff of methane, but they still don't know the source potentially, and they still don't know why it only comes now and again, because they've gone back over that area, and sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. So this is a real mystery still.
So a rumor about life on Mars from the cracks in the meteoritical tissues. Have you heard about the development of that particular issue?
No, I haven't actually.
Martian meteoritical tissues was found about 3 years ago.
Yeah, it's a famous one. Of course, the problem with anything that falls to Earth is how long was it sitting on the ground before it was collected and all of the rest of that. It always just makes the science harder. So if we have a chance to go and collect something pristine and bring it back, that's the ideal. I'd have to see what that research says. It's, like I said, we're at the forefront of what science is capable of doing, and sometimes there are false trails or exciting leads that have potential, but it's hard to prove. And one thing I want all of you guys to remember is that we're chemical systems, right? We're chemistry, but we're also biology. And the dividing line between those two, when you get down to a single cell, is really challenging, especially if the single cell, all that you have is not it's still wiggling, but something that's 3.5 billion years old. How do you prove that the remnants of a squashed, degraded, irradiated single cell was by life and not by chemistry? There are ways to do it, but it's really challenging, and that's where we are at now.
I think we'll take, yes.
So, in the beginning you were saying that you were excited by different prospects about different conditions that were required for life.
Yeah.
And as we know it, we need carbon to form life. Are there any other scenarios, say, within our solar system, which aren't based around carbon, that you're excited by?
So this is a question that comes up very much, and unfortunately, I'm not a real good person to ask that question to, because I don't know enough about it. But people always think, oh, could it form from silica? Or could life form from sulfur? And, you know, chemistry is all about available energy. And there are microbes on Earth that only need one electron to make their living from. Not even from sunlight, just from chemical energy. And it can even be a positive electron or a negative charge. It can go either way. So you don't need much once life has kind of figured out a way to do what it does. But anything other than carbon is chemically harder because the molecules are bigger, they don't form the variety of molecules that carbon can. So maybe it's possible, and we don't know. But the reality is that anything outside of carbon is harder. And so that's something to think about. The other thing is that, like I said before, carbon's incredibly common, water's incredibly common. If you're going to make a cake, you use flour, but because it's everywhere, right? So to make life, carbon, oxygen, those are the basic building blocks. So question is, I don't know. Or the answer is, I don't know.
Well, I think we might wrap up there and thank Martin for a fantastic talk. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you. It was great.
Thanks very much for coming.
It was great.
Appreciate it.